Disclaimer: the games discussed in this video features content not appropriate for young audiences, including gratuitous violence, disturbing imagery, and gorgon boobies. If you are watching this video and the things I stated make you uncomfortable, the rest of the video may not be suitable. You have been warned. Hey, what is up everybody? This is Blackblade, and has there ever been a series you took a while to get to, but once you finally did, it was everything you hoped it would be? Yeah, that's God of War. Simply put, the reason it took so long was finally getting a system I could play them on. However, once that problem was solved, it was only a matter of time. I'm guilty of getting games I say I need to play and then having them sit on my shelf for years and years, collecting dust and possibly growing a vengeful spite for me. With this trilogy, however, I played through each game back to back as soon as I picked up the collection, and then 8 months later played it again during off time of visiting family, and then over the course of the past year played through each once more. Needless to say, I put more time into this series relative to each game's length than any other series in the past 2 years. I love it a ton, but I'm a little sadistic. Seeing a trilogy of games go together well just isn't enough for me. I like to analyze stuff closely and determine as objectively as I'm capable of which is the best overall. This brings us to the point of today's video. We're going to take a look at each game in 10 different and important elements to see which one towers above the rest, and then proceeds to eat the offspring of the others because that's just the God of War way. So we'll get started with that in a moment, but first, let's meet the contestants, shall we? God of War was released in 2005 as a PlayStation 2 exclusive by Santa Monica Studio. As a hack and slash inspired by the first Devil May Cry, with additional focus on puzzle solving and a sense of adventure meant to pay homage to classic stories set in ancient Greece like Jason and the Argonauts, this game became almost an immediate classic, garnering considerable praise and becoming the 11th best-selling game on the system. However, despite how favorable the reception was, it became clear that certain aspects of the game, from the free-flow combat to the blood-pumping set pieces and boss battles, could be expanded upon. As such, 2 years later, the game received a sequel for the same system. It was an odd decision, as by the time of its release, the PS3 had been on store shelves for 4 months and had yet to acquire many system sellers. This could have been an opportunity, but instead they decided to release it for the previous system as, and I quote, "There's 100 million people out there that will be able to play God of War 2 as soon as it launches. As a game maker, that is the best possible situation you can be in. You want the largest possible audience of people to have the opportunity to play your game. So, was it worth the cost to put the game out on dated hardware? Absolutely. God of War 2 kept the positive momentum and reception going from the first, putting more into the story and lore and additional changes we'll get into later. The story is the most important element to mention though, as this game ended on a cliffhanger, hinting towards a final climactic chapter with an all-out war between the gods and the titans. That chapter would come in the form of the final game in this trilogy 3 years later. God of War 3 would release in spring of 2010 as a highly anticipated release that somehow managed to live up to the expectations 3 years had brought about. Praised considerably for the sheer scope it delivers, it would be classified from the beginning as the best PlayStation 3 exclusive yet, behind MGS4, and Uncharted 2, and Infamous. And holy crap, there are a lot of good PS3 games. Now, I mentioned each game was received with near unanimous approval, but was vague in explaining why. That's because for however many minutes this video turns out to be, we'll be going over bit by bit what makes these games so good. Without further delay, let's get started. God of War's art style is very nostalgic to me. For better and worse, it looks how games typically would back in 2005, the time frame most games I grew up with came from. As an adventure game, it has a lot of varying environments to present, from ships caught in a horrible storm to temple grounds long since abandoned by humanity. In doing so, a lot of the backgrounds and model work is very simple, only differing enough to distinguish location from location. Instead, more effort went into the character models and animations. They're still a little clunky, but they offer good visibility upon overlapping and have this defined gritty Greek style to them. This style also translates to the UI elements, which normally I avoid discussing in videos, but decided to mention here because it's very aesthetically pleasing to me. Then, lastly, we have the cutscene graphics, which in my notes I praised, but the more I look at them, the more they feel off. Now, I'm not going to say they're bad. It still looks crisp and clean for PS2 visuals, but the problem I have lies in how the characters move or interact with the environment. It feels too mocap-y, we'll pretend that's a word, like how FMV cutscenes looked back when that was a thing. Oh, how I miss those days, I wasn't even born to reminisce. So comparing them to standards at the time, I'd say they're slightly above average, a feeling that carries over for the second mostly. The jump in quality for gameplay graphics is honestly rather subtle, but also properly updates the visuals as much as possible while maintaining solid performance on old hardware. The environments, the character models, the textures, and how the things interact with the other things is all done about as nicely as the PS2 allows for, though it is just a little awkward with animations compared to newly set standards at the time. That said, there's one point of considerable praise here, and that's the change in quality for the cutscenes. No, not these cutscenes, though they too are quite nice. I mean these ones. While there may only be a few of them in the game overall, 4 that I can remember, each one still holds up beautifully. This looks very clean and is about as much of a spike from gameplay to pre-rendered graphics as you can get without feeling completely off. Honestly, seeing this makes me think of how cool it would be for a game where the in-game graphics looks as cool as the cutscenes.
My vengeance ends now.
I'm gonna give you all what I like to call a wholesome hot take. I think God of War 3 is still one of the most technically impressive games to date almost a decade after release. I mean, what am I supposed to say? The quality of the models and animations got cranked up to 27, and the environments are absolutely breathtaking, like the overlook of Tartarus, or the cavern containing Daedalus's labyrinth. The lighting is fantastic, the frame rate is smooth as butter, it's just all so amazing. I would say it's beautiful enough to live here, but I also don't want to die a horrific death from a world-ending disaster, so I'll leave it at that. Graphic design goes to God of War 3. One of the few specific things I stated in the introduction was how the first God of War was praised for its free-flow combat system, one that would become underappreciated in YouTube videos where people spam square square triangle for the rest of time. God of War's combat mechanics are wonderful, perhaps even among the best I've seen. What sets it apart for me is just how well everything flows together. Pretty much any move you make has 3 or 4 different follow-ups, all with varying situational use, but more importantly just fun to mix up your combos. If you're like me and get bored quick when spamming the same move or sequence of moves in succession, this is the system you're dreaming of having instead, believe me. Also, as an additional point, the magic system is not something I expected when I first played this game, but I quickly grew to love it, especially since this has the most fun magic wheel in my opinion. It complements the already great moveset that much more. Meanwhile, when it comes to the next game, my praise will come with a hint of salt, because apparently all my favorite moves in the first were inadequate or something. Seriously, I'm not kidding. Almost every one of my favorite moves to use with the Blades of Chaos are gone in this one, though some of the replacements are pretty great in their own right, so I can't be too mad. Honestly, it's smart from a developer's standpoint that they use this game to make the mechanics a little more streamlined and easy to execute. The combat still has a solid amount of depth, just not as much. However, not everything is a downscaled version of the previous installment. In the first game, if for some reason you got tired of the Blades of Chaos or wanted some extra damage, you had the Blade of Artemis. It wasn't always practical, but that didn't make it any less fun to dismember enemies with ease. This game decided to give you not just one sub-weapon though, but instead 3. Once again, none are as good as the main blades or even the first game's sub-weapon, but they still had a good amount of variety to combat. To make progression further enjoyable though, they also included more items throughout the game that extended your options, such as the Golden Fleece for deflections, or the Icarus Wings for lifting enemies up in the air and throwing wind in their face stronger than a leaf blower. These 2 changes to the formula seem to stick, which I assume is why the third game went all out with the variety. Instead of having a main weapon with sub-weapons, they decided to simplify the blades even further, once again gutting my favorite moves because apparently I'm not allowed to enjoy life, but then combining them with claws, fists, and whatever that thing is, each with the same depth behind their design. Add onto that a smooth rotation system, additional equipment like bows, boots, and the severed head of Helios. Welcome to pain. And you get more than enough tools. Literally, more than enough. Because in addition to lacking as much depth, it's also overwhelming to the point where you'll forget certain assets you had. Now before you leave a comment about how I need to jump down the chains of Olympus with a faulty parachute, please note that I'm not knocking points because the third game has too much to work with or anything. I love that there is so much to experiment with, you're hard-pressed to properly try it all upon your first visit. However, while I consider this to be a good system, I think a system where that variety feels more tangible by letting you do as many things with just one weapon is better. This is getting complicated, so let me clear it up this way. 3 system is awesome, but overall the combat goes to God of War 1. However, mechanics don't matter much if you don't have solid level design to boot. As cool as the combat sequences are, the puzzles and level set pieces matter just as much in this series. After all, why else would people refer to it as an action-adventure game? Stop! The first God of War captures this need for balance well. Some sections of the game are as simple in design as just directing you to the next fight, like most of Athens. But then there's this little thing called Pandora's Temple. The level of creativity and set pieces is on full display here, though still 90% of the time involve fighting. As a result, it adds to making sure you never get bored of experiencing what this game has to offer. Yet, despite how iconic Pandora's Temple is, design-wise, it can't compete with the Temple of Fates from God of War 2. Remember I said most of the memorable moments from the first were still based around action? Well, the sequel still contains a good amount of those, but also some sequences either using the Amulet of Fates or just pure wit to pass. The best example of how most of the puzzles are designed in this game is this room, where you need to have 2 pressure plates pressed at once. One is behind a lowered gate and resets sooner than the one in the middle of the room, but on the other side is a corpse you can pick up. However, as you can't carry it over the gate, you'll have to look for another way to reach the plate with it. Paying close attention, you'll see the walls are cracked in each corner, and breaking through them will reveal a current of water. Setting the body in there will cause the current to carry it over to the other side, allowing you to pick it up from there, set it down, and you're in business. Honestly, I can't think of any other hack and slash games I've played containing sections as fun to go through as the fights. It's a unique trait to God of War 2 that sets it apart from the rest. Well, God of War 3 has it too, though not much beyond the labyrinth and the admittedly very creative Hera's Garden. In fact, if you for a moment take the bosses in this game out of the equation, which trust me I understand is hard to do, there aren't as many notable set pieces. You've got the 2 I just mentioned, the Trials of Erebus, and the Icarus Ascent, which, okay, not gonna lie, that's possibly my favorite sequence in this trilogy. What I mean to say is while the moments of standout level design are exceptional in this game, it doesn't have as many hits overall as Pandora's Temple in 1 or the entire game of 2. Judging by that statement, you can probably tell where I'm going with this. Level design goes to God of War 2. There are many things that make the original God of War feel it belongs properly in the time period it was released, and the difficulty is a good reason as to why. A friend of mine described it best, even if he was talking about a different hack and slash from the same period of time. Its difficulty is definitely artificial, but not in a way that feels cheap or hurts the experience overall. Basically, the game nearly all throughout feels balanced with a proper difficulty curve coinciding with the player's knowledge and character progression. Other than a couple sections that stand out as particularly tedious, like protecting Kratos' family at the end, and that stupid conveyor belt room that makes me want to tear Poseidon's eyes out, everything remains appropriately challenging even on hard difficulty. God of War 2 is also quite fair, and the sections that wouldn't be as fair get a pass as you often tend to get resources as cheap as the enemies are in these points. Tip for anyone who plays this game: in the room with the lever bringing down a hook and Hades nymphs coming out of the woodwork, use Kronos' Rage. That move gives you so many more safe windows. Despite being balanced throughout, the game still takes a massive hit compared to the other 2 for one key reason. Remember all the sub-weapons and other moves I mentioned earlier? Well, playing the first game on hard mode still lets you make use of almost all of your abilities. God of War 2, on the other hand, severely limits your viable options in combat. As an example, I tried getting through this one section using the Spear of Destiny because I just wanted to, and died 5 times in a row, but then I gave in and used the blades and beat it my first try doing so. Like I said, it's still balanced, but it also brings about its fair share of annoyances. And if you play the series in order on hard mode, as I so painfully didn't while gathering footage, seeing the limited moveset in 2 is concerning when moving to the treasure chest of gadgetry in 3. However, I'm here to say there's nothing to fear. Except when up to 3 Cyclops drop down next to you at once. That's horrifying. Aside from that though, this game was released in 2010, back when games were starting to move on from difficulty through artificial means. There's not much I can say about this one beyond the fact that it qualifies for the beautiful 3-word classification of challenging yet fair. Basically, 3's balance is the same as the first game, but the challenge feels more genuine. As such, difficulty goes to God of War 3. As if difficulty wasn't specific enough of an aspect to rate. I just want to give more praise to the first game, okay? God of War, as I mentioned, focuses a lot on featuring a free-flow combat system, and while a moveset that chains together nicely is good and all, to make that work, controls are much more important. I'm happy to say though that they function beautifully. Controls in games are one of those things you only take notice of if they're exceptional or awful, and this is about as perfect as you can get. So how do you combat perfection? You don't. But that doesn't mean you can't be good. God of War 2 controls great. The Golden Fleece parrying has about as forgiving a window as you can have without feeling too easy. Attacks still chain together well in a way that feels responsive without the need for senseless button mashing. The reason why I only consider it great and not masterful is because compared to the first, it feels oversimplified. I said I could understand the mechanics being more accessible to general players, but the controls were already smooth and quick to pick up. As a result, they feel too straightforward and lack the constant flow present in the first. Then, lastly, we have 3. And 3 seems to address this complaint nicely. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it just feels closer to the smoothness on display in the original. In fact, for the most part, 3 does a good job at capturing what made the first feel so good to play, but there is one thing holding it back, and that's just how many different moves and things you have to juggle. God of War 3 requires more precision as you can much more easily bring up a weapon that you didn't want to switch to, or use the wrong piece of equipment. On the plus side, at least you can air dodge in this one. All 3 games nail the controls pretty well, but overall, I have to give this one to God of War. This is why I said earlier to separate the set pieces in 3 from its boss battles. Because they are such an important element of the series, I needed to give them their own aspect. One of the most notable parts of the original God of War was just how magnificent the boss battles were. From the Hydra in the opening sequence, Pandora's Guardian in the temple, and the final climactic showdown with Ares, the bosses in this game were infrequent but made up for it extensively with how awesome they were. Pandora's Guardian in particular is one of my favorite boss battles to date, with different angles to attack it from and visible signs of wear as the fight goes on and its armor is slowly but surely rendered. Each tests the player in creative ways, like the tug of war health bar in the final battle that I honestly can't recall seeing in any other game like this. Seeing as people love the bosses so much, it was made a focal point in the sequel, which is why they bumped it up from 3 to 12. Some of these 12 are phenomenal, especially the final few of the Kraken, Lachesis and Atropos, and Zeus. However, while the first game is quality over quantity, the second is the opposite. While I would consider most of them to be good, a lot of them lack individual weight compared to the encounters in the previous game. It's a small change, but enough to make them feel a little weaker in comparison. And then we have God of War 3. If you've seen the hack and slash versus beat 'em up games video I made, you'll remember I made some references to the quality and scale of the bosses here. Will allow me to expand on this in a way by no means hyperbolic whatsoever.
This is the best boss design I've ever seen in a game to date.
There are 9 bosses in God of War 3, though personally 2 of them I wouldn't count. Seeing as at this point in the games though you've already slain most famous Greek monsters or heroes, that leaves the remaining encounters this game has to offer to be the gods and titans themselves. And Hercules.
Disappointed!
You know how a lot of games will have some really good boss battles, and then there's that one that stands out as a masterpiece in how to design a good fight? Well, this game doesn't just have one of those, it has 5. These fights are incredible, either by breathtaking scale, being properly challenging, containing strong story significance, or all 3. The first fight against Poseidon in particular is in all likelihood my favorite boss battle I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing, with scaling the body of Gaia to face the hippocampi, duking it out with the Lord of the Ocean himself, and then finishing him off in a sequence so brutal it sets the tone for just how despicable Kratos turns out to be in this game. More on that later. Without question, the bosses go to God of War 3. Guess what the most difficult aspect to rate these was? It was the controls, but this takes a close second. These 3 games together have an amazing composition, thanks to the efforts of Ron Fish. The first game's soundtrack established some classic motifs that I find myself humming at times while putting away dishes. It makes use of just about every sound you might think of if someone asked you what ancient Greece sounds like, which is an odd question to be asked, but you never know. There is one problem with it though, and that's how most of the tracks here blend together too much. The ones that stand out really stand out, like Vengeful Spartan, the Minotaur theme, or Zeus's Wrath Divine, but a lot of others, specifically combat themes, sound too similar to one another. Thankfully, the second doesn't have this issue. Now if you asked me to name tracks from it off the top of my head, I'd be a little more hard-pressed, but that's not enough of a fault to hold the quality of the score back. The more important thing is they do a great job at enhancing the tone of the situation. The music during the first and final battles is exemplary. However, once again, 3 takes the best elements of each and combines them to form a final soundtrack that's both memorable out of game and makes every gameplay sequence that much more dramatic. They also use tracks established in the previous 2 games in a way that feels more fitting, I guess you could put it. Let me give you an example. This is how the exact same track is used in God of War 2 and 3. Brief shout out to the Icarus Ascent theme for possibly being one of the single tracks in a game I have listened to the most. To summarize, the soundtrack goes again to God of War 3. God of War has a solid structure to the game's pacing. It starts off with a quick high burst of action, then calms down a bit at least by this series standards, and slowly builds back up to that level, eventually surpassing it towards the finale. This, in my opinion, is the type of pacing most hack and slash games should strive for. It makes the shortest game in the trilogy still feel like it holds substance while also not being too short that you're left unsatisfied by the end. After setting a good formula, the sequel expanded on this in all the right ways. It features an even more bombastic start, showing off the maneuvers you'll have access to by the end, then brings you back down to square one. What's commendable, however, is to increase the length of the game. Instead of just drawing out the progression you experience in the first, they instead go at the same pace and spend more time at the pinnacle. In other words, the last 2.5 hours of this game are awesome, really keeping you hooked to the very end. This also carries well into the third game, which, as I mentioned before when talking about Poseidon, is an incredibly strong start. But then Kratos dies and ends up in Hades. The third game tries to capture the same idea as the second in starting you off with most of your abilities, but transitioning from the Blades of Athena to the Blades of Exile is awkward to say the least. See, the second game uses this opening as a way to let the player figure out from the start the differences between the moveset they had in the first and this new one. 3 instead uses the time after the opening to do so, and it hurts the game a little. It starts to pick up again as it goes on though, slowing a little bit after Hera's Garden, but ending off with an incredible series of fights with Zeus. The pacing is still overall pretty good, but compared to the others, it's less gradual. Generally speaking, the pacing is best handled by God of War 2. God of War is a fantastic game in many aspects, but one area it's not as strong in is the bonus features. While there are parts of it that I enjoy, overall the challenge of the gods is lacking in substance, either with some challenges being rather lame, or others acting as a test of patience and a little more. At least the Ballista one was amusing in a morbid way. Beyond the challenge mode, unless you just happen to love this game as much as I do, want to pull your hair out with God mode, or just can't go on with your life until you play Scuba Kratos, there isn't much incentive to replay this game. Lucky for us, God of War 2 addressed the lack of additional content. The challenge mode feels a little less tacked on this time, with only 7 challenges but each being disconnected and featuring a rating system. This makes it more enjoyable for completionists and having the extra task of completing each challenge on Titan rank, which for a certain challenge means you spend 3.5 hours on it, filling up your hard drive with footage you'll never need this much of, but you just keep going because you don't know how to stop, despite it eating away at your sanity to where suddenly the atrocities Kratos commits later on in the story no longer seem that bad. Plus, getting Titan rank on all of them unlocks the Arena of the Fates, a custom mode that honestly feels kinda lacking to me, but maybe that's just me. As far as replay value, there's a little more to make it interesting. From more great costumes, urns of power that essentially act as cheat codes, and unrestricted access to the third sub-weapon in the game, the Blade of Olympus. This is what draws me the most, as getting to finally use a weapon you only get about 20 to 30 minutes of in total is awfully enticing. However, it's not enough to make me want to replay the entire game in its own right, but again, that might just be me. What would do that is perhaps including an urn allowing you to use the Blades of Athena for the entirety of God of War 3. Oh look, it's an urn that does exactly that! I haven't done so yet, admittedly, but getting to use my favorite moves from the second game that were taken from me in this one is awesome, and if offered by 2 beyond just one spell from the first game would have been marvelous. As such, 3 has the best replay value as it offers the most game-changing post-unlocks. On top of that though, it also has my favorite challenge mode. The rankings are gone, though the stats still counted, but the challenges themselves seem the most unique. The one where you get to ride a Cyclops is particularly awesome because who wouldn't want to smack everything to oblivion? The only problem here is that, while they gave the arena a few good changes like more enemies at once, it still doesn't have enough substance to be a real standout. Still, I think it's safe to say the bonus content goes to God of War 3. There are many aspects of note to the original God of War, but one of my favorites is the story. Sure, I'll be the first to admit, it's not very deep or anything, but I don't feel it has any need to be. The first game in the series feels very much like a classic Greek epic, with a straightforward quest, a larger-than-life struggle to complete said quest, and a simple yet satisfying conclusion of redemption and perseverance. Also, this story introduces us to the character of Kratos, and honestly the way he's handled in this story is incredible. A lot of modern stories featuring the Greek pantheon include characters that don't really fit in with the other gods. But even here, when the seat of the god of war is held by Ares, another great character that makes for a perfect foil to the protagonist, Kratos still fits in this setting. He's a broken man with a history of grievances and misdoings, yet despite still not being the most favorable person in existence, his motivations are clear and you can still side with him. Overall, the story for the first game is pretty great, and honestly feels like it could be a complete narrative in its own right. However, the demand for a sequel meant the demand for a continuation of the story as well, and all things considered, 2's story is still pretty solid. Growing tired of the airheadedness of the other Olympians, Kratos starts becoming a little testy. As such, Zeus steals his godly powers and then kills him. Okay, in this trilogy, Kratos dying isn't that big a deal. This man is literally the embodiment of the too angry to die meme. After meeting Gaia in the afterlife, Kratos is given her aid in order to reach the Temple of Fates and turn back time to stop Zeus from killing him, which honestly opens up a whole can of time travel worms, but that's fine. This game expands on the mythos of this telling of Greek mythology, and throughout the story we see several cases, such as with Prometheus and the Last Spartan, demonstrating the cruelty of Zeus. It's a story that doesn't really do anything inherently wrong, but it doesn't hold the same classic feel as the first. Despite being good, it's dependent on the other chapters to carry weight, which holds it back from reaching the same pedestal. But then we have 3A. God of War 3 drops the ball. I'm sorry, folks. It gives the conclusion people asked for and features some interesting elements such as the stories of Hephaestus and Pandora. These two steal the show whenever they're on screen. Aside from that though, and getting to see just how corrupt all the other gods and titans have become, not just Zeus, this story doesn't have as much substance as 1 or 2. However, the problem doesn't lie in that, or the somewhat cheesy ending about fear and hope that undermines the weight of the conclusion somewhat. No, the biggest problem for this game's story is Kratos. In the first game, I praised this character for being someone you couldn't justify the flaws of, yet still felt confident in rooting for. In the second, he's a little more flat and even angsty to a degree, but you can still understand him. In this game, however, he becomes irredeemable. On top of having absolutely no regard or remorse for the people around him, other than Pandora only at the last minute, he also acts like a bratty kid on a playground. Overly smug, immature, this is a clear example of how not to make a flawed protagonist, as it reaches the point where you don't even want to play as him anymore. I forgot I locked it. The poor taste left by this Kratos, however, will not affect the better version of the character in the first game. Story goes to God of War. Well, that was exhausting, but here we are. All 10 aspects have been explored in as much depth as I could manage without going insane. But we're not done yet. The point of this video is to find out which game is the best of the bunch, and to do that we'll be tallying up the points each one received, with 5 points for every first place, 3 for every second, and 1 for every third. Taking that into account, I've got the number 1 pick, but first we have the runner-ups, and stuck with the fate of having last place in this ranking is God of War 2. Don't let that discredit the game though. God of War 2 is a fantastic hack and slash, pushing the PS2 to the limits of what it's capable of. With solid pacing and very strong level design, this game took a lot of good notes from the first game and expanded on the weaker elements. However, despite being great in its own right, the biggest issue this game faces is falling victim to middle-of-the-road syndrome. If you've played, read, or seen a lot of trilogies, you likely know sometimes the middle entry in that trilogy can be overshadowed by the other two, feeling more as a bridge between them than a standout story in its own right. That's not to say it doesn't stand out in certain elements, but when looking at them individually this way, it's not as solid. And as the runner-up, the decider on how this trilogy will be ranked, we have, with 30 points, God of War 1. You may be wondering, why the sigh? Well, if I was judging this list by personal favorite, this would be at the top without question. God of War is a game that feels dated, but in the best way possible. From the way it's structured, how the story is told, the feel of gameplay, the graphic design, even the artificial but still fair difficulty, everything about this game makes it feel like a time capsule of my personal favorite era of gaming, the 6th generation. The bosses are stellar, the soundtrack catchy, and the combat system is one of my absolute absolute favorites. There are a few ways the game could have been even better, such as adding a little more incentive to revisit it, but after all is said and done, this is still an amazing game everyone should play. And by process of elimination, taking the top spot in our ranking with 34 points is none other than the juggernaut that kicked off the previous decade of gaming, God of War 3. God of War 3 is a game that redefines the meaning of the word scale. The best way I could describe it to someone who hasn't played it or doesn't even play video games is like this. Imagine the Battle of Helm's Deep, except an entire game of that. From a stunningly beautiful art style, a climactic intense soundtrack, and among the best selection of boss battles period, everything this game offers is an over-the-top blast throughout almost the entire experience. I didn't even get to mention things like getting to see the gods and titans duke it out in the background of levels and a spectacular clash of powers and colors. This is the type of finale Trilogy should hope to achieve, just hopefully with a better send-off of their main character. Which Kratos did in fact get the chance to receive again, but I haven't played that game. I need a system that can play it first. Still, no matter which game won in the end, the whole trilogy is incredible, and one of my best experiences in recent gaming memory. If you have a system that can play it and haven't experienced it yet, do so as soon as possible. More than likely, you won't regret it. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, be sure to slice that like button in half, subscribe to my channel if you are new, and comment down below what you think. Perhaps your opinions differ from mine, or you're like me and think the first game was more deserving of the top spot. Regardless, let me know what you think of these games and of this video format. I'd like to make more like it in the future, and would appreciate some feedback on where I can improve. Once again though, hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.
I was trying to make you a great warrior. You succeeded.